So welcome everybody. Welcome to the second day of the Social Simulation Week. We are here today at the workshop organized by the ESA Special Intense Group in using qualitative data for deciding on behavior rules. This is a workshop for integrating qualitative and quantitative evidence using social simulation. I am Melania Borit from the University of Tromsø, known now as the UiT, the Artic University of Norway. This session is co-organized together with Bruce Edmonds at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, Martin Neumann from Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz, Germany, and Stefan Ongo from University of Southampton. And I will be chairing the session together with Bruce. We have a full schedule. We have 3 hours, 6 speakers, and 1 interactive session. So the session will be recorded. So that just so you know that you'll be on camera. Then I think we can just start. And the first speaker for today is Bruce Edmonds. So Bruce, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, let's find my slides. It's better doing this. Okay, where's it? Oh, there we go. That's good. Can people see my slides?
Yes.
Good. Okay. But I can't see the chat at the same time as the slides, right?
No, but I can follow the chat.
You can follow the chat. Good, good. Okay, right. I'm just going to give you a short introduction to this topic, just to, in a sense, get people up to speed of where we are. Now, simulation modelers have always used informal knowledge to inform what they're doing. For example, Scott Moss in 1998. However, the qualitative evidence, how the qualitative evidence relates to the model can be then not entirely explicit. It can be a bit vague, it can be sort of intuitive, and thus can be very difficult to be followed or critiqued by another researcher. So what happens, you have some discussions, this informs your general intuitive knowledge, which then informs how you design your simulation, but the steps are opaque. They are a little bit of sort of black box magic. Due to the power of our brains to deal with semantic knowledge. Starting with Richard Taylor and Sakana's work in 2003-04, that's when they published their thesis. These were examples where the qualitative data was explicitly recorded and analyzed in a more open way that allows how you got to the simulation to be traced and the process to be critiqued. So you started with discussions, which was recorded in qualitative data, which can then be analyzed and made into simulation components. Okay, and the importance of this is obviously somebody else can go back and look at it, can disagree with it, can maybe do it in a different way from the same qualitative data. In 2005, Scott and I suggested using qualitative data in evidence to inform the specification of the micro level of a model, i.e. how agents behave, which you then run and validate against aggregate quantitative data. So you can, as soon as you have a simulation model, you can extract whatever measurements you want out of it, and then compare it against time series and stuff like that. So the idea of this is that without a simulation model, linking micro data to macro data takes theory or narrative accounts. Again, it is a rich semantic way of linking the qualitative data to the micro data to the macro data. The simulation makes that link far more precise. You can actually see how the behavioral rules and the way you specified the model result in the aggregate outcomes coming out. It gives a precise result, but often there are lots of alternative routes from the micro to the macro. But there are lots of other ways of using qualitative data as well as from the micro to the macro. So one example is generating stories out of your model. So following an individual agent around as the model goes around and generating a pseudo-narrative of what's happening to it when, so that, and that's useful talking to stakeholders because it's more meaningful and it can be critiqued much more easily. Maybe you might interpret the aggregate results of a model in qualitative terms, stylized facts from economics, or using semi-formalized data such as characteristics of a social network. In general, agent-based modeling can be used to integrate a whole variety of kinds of evidence at both the model specification and model validation stages. Young and Gilbert had a nice early survey where they discussed this in 2008. I like to see this as coming from some underlying principles. And I agree, there are probably more. There always are with underlying principles. So number one is you need to respect the complexity and complication of the social world we know about. It is both semantically rich, i.e. there will be things happening in the social world that we cannot put into any model, that is beyond our ability to program, that is to do with values or something that is very hard to formalize, even in a very complicated model. But also you need to respect the complication of the social world. Our human minds are not going to be able to keep track of all the little bits in the model, in the world that are interacting. It is literally beyond our capability to hold all that in our mind at one point, so partly why we need models to do that. I mean respect in the sense of not simplifying it just for the sake of things, or not simplifying it without actually noting when and where you are simplifying it and understanding some of the implication of your assumptions. Number two, if you're a scientist or you claim to be doing science in any sense, social science, then you shouldn't ignore evidence. It's a very basic principle of science is you shouldn't ignore evidence without a very, 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 very good reason. Consequence of that is neither qualitative nor quantitative data should be ignored. If you're a scientist, you shouldn't ignore data, whatever kind. All data has its own difficulties. Qualitative data has its own difficulties. Quantitative data has its own difficulties. That doesn't mean you should ignore it. Thirdly, good research tends to be cautious, encouraging dialogue, transparency, critique, so making our models data processes as explicit as possible and documented. And these sort of principles should inform how we deal with qualitative, the bridging from qualitative data to simulation models. So there are quite a lot of underlying tensions in trying to square this circle, trying to make qualitative knowledge and formal simulation models relate to each other. Obviously, one of the big ones is that normal natural language has semantic content, it's meaningful, while simulation models are a formal, maybe a very complicated, but a formal process, which in a sense is complicated, but semantically very thin. Another tension is in all qualitative data, there's contextual information or assumptions that are there but are not made explicit, that are not said. It's well known that natural language depends on people having a knowledge of some knowledge of shared context, and so we don't have to explain everything every time we talk, but a lot of it is limited by the context, and that can be very difficult to make explicit or point out. There's tensions between whether you use qualitative information in the specification or the validation of models, which level you use data at, how much structure to impose when you're interpreting qualitative data. Are you going to assume a framework, maybe Ostram's framework or somebody else's framework, and impose that on your understanding of the qualitative data to help you translate it? Be aware that if you're iterating model development over time, then the qualitative data can't be used for both specification and validation. And then, of course, what your objective for the model is. This is a purely participatory one. Your objective is to increase understanding between the participants. Is the model just a way of communication, a mediating object, or are you aiming for something that is more objectively true in some sense? And all of these issues, these tensions are there when you are trying to use qualitative information and simulation models together. Ending up with the potential, there's a significant resource of qualitative data that could be more useful to modelers. Modelers tend not to use it because it's difficult and it's questionable and it doesn't feel scientific. But if we do, models might become more open to the complexity of the social life we observe. There's lots of very useful insights in qualitative research. I find some of their theorizing in the qualitative research less useful, but their data and their observation I find very useful. If we produce better ways of doing this bridging between qualitative data and simulations, establish protocols, ways of doing it, guidelines, standards, that could make the whole process more accessible to modelers and help ensure that these bridging steps can be understood, followed by others, and critiqued by others, and thus make the whole process more rigorous. Okay, that's it. I've included the references if you want to download the slides, and that's all I'm going to say. Note the SIG blog. If you want to keep in touch with this SIG and what it's doing, that is the blog where we announce things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Let's see. The applause. Okay, thank you. For this session, we have asked the presenters to prepare some questions for the audience.
Melania, I cannot hear you properly.
You cannot hear me.
Yeah, you're very mute. You're very low in sound.
Yeah, me as well, for me.
Is it better now? Is it better now? Okay, good.
Yes.
So, thank you, Bruce, for your presentation. I was just saying that we have asked the presenters to prepare 1-2 questions for the audience. And then we can also ask the audience to ask some questions to the presenter. So let's see if the audience has some questions. And then maybe, Bruce, you have 1 or 2 questions to the audience connected to your presentation. So yes, any questions from the audience? I don't see any hands up here. So maybe, Bruce, you want to ask Nanda.
I have a question.
Okay, Pedro, you have a question. And then Nanda, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, so Pedro and then Nanda.
So just to, with regards to your point 2 of underlying principles, I'm going to put the camera on as seems to be the custom.
Yes, it's nice to see you while
yes.
you're talking. Yes,
hi.
Hello there.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. That was really useful and interesting. I have a question with regards to the second underlying principle that you say, that we should not ignore data without a very good reason, right?
Yes.
But there's two issues that I have with that. The first being that data is usually not available, or in the opposite case, there's too much of it, and it's just impossible to incorporate the whole of it without getting into contradictions. So what is it for you a good reason to ignore data?
Well, if you don't know the data, or you don't, that's a good reason for not for ignoring it. You can't deal with data you don't know about. That's a perfectly valid reason. And in fact, one of the principles I try and use in my model is to use the data I know about and try and base it on stuff I know, as an example. If you have too much data, then yes, that is a problem. But that doesn't mean you should ignore it. You should look for some way of summarizing it, or taking it on board, or even just learning the lessons from it in a broad way. Our research, because we're researching something that is so complicated and complex, the social world, often research has to be staged, and there's someone analyzing big lots of data, which then informs our model, which then is used in some experiment, etc. So it is going to be necessarily a sort of team effort. It doesn't mean you all have to do it yourself, but you could just, for example, note the data, say there is data on this, but I haven't been able to analyze it or summarize it, but it would be obviously useful. So somebody else can do it. In that way, you're not ignoring it.
Right, right. And what could be an example actually of a very good reason to ignore the data that you've come across?
Well, for example, if you know it might be wrong.
Right.
That's a good reason. So, you know, when some very dodgy results about trials for a COVID vaccine were coming out, that was from this dodgy consultancy company, and it turned out they couldn't provide the data, and they, etc., etc. Yeah, you start saying this data, no, or it contradicts some other data, and you have to make a choice between data. You can be explicit. I mean, there are good reasons, but you know, the obligation, if you think you're doing science, you have to provide a good reason for ignoring data.
Right, right.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Nanda, and then Zanli has a question too. Nanda, you are on mute.
Nanda?
I know, but I was hunting my mouse to go to the right screen. Okay, there I am. So I actually wanted to ask a question about the starting point, like because the idea is that we make everything transparent and checkable by others. And although I totally agree with what you say, and I actually would love to do that, I wonder whether we can really pull that through to the end, because this process is very, there are some creative elements in it in terms of interpreting. Even if I talk to an expert, even if I have data and I analyze it and I trace everything I do, there is a creative element in there that is our skill as a modeler. So there might be a bit of pride in there as well, but I think it's mainly also like, how this step, which you can
how do we do it?
How do we do that? And I have no answer to how to.
Well, okay, I think people got different answers. I mean, you notice I slipped in some weasel words. You know, we need to make it as clear and as possible. Okay, because there are lots. Language is very complicated, and it relies a lot on, for example, contextual assumptions, and it's very subtle. And we don't know how to formally analyze language completely. Nobody completely knows how we do it as human beings. So there will be steps in which we add in our own interpretation or structures in that. Absolutely. And it may be impossible to do otherwise. But you try and note when you're aware of adding assumptions, say that, or if you're using a particular framework for interpreting the data, at least the framework is explicit. Ostrom's framework, for example, you can say we're fitting it into that. and then people can see it, and then at least others have a chance of trying to follow what you're doing. And maybe almost inevitably, I'd have thought they would come up with a different answer than you do.
Yes,
but then at least you can see where they diverge and where the different answers come from.
Mhm.
And I think that's progress. I think it is very difficult.
Thanks.
It's a difficult problem we've chosen.
Yeah, but also the beauty of our work, I find. I mean, it's one of
Yes, it can go on forever, right?
yeah. No, but it's also this, I don't know, when you engage with data, when you engage with experts, to get this feel of what they mean and how they interpret the world.
Takes
And
time, doesn't it?
And to translate that also in terms of in terms of choices for the model. I find that the fun part of my job.
Yes, it's definitely creative. It's not a mechanical process. No. And I can't foresee it will become a mechanical process.
No, me neither. Not in my lifetime.
We have 2 more minutes from Bruce's part of this session. So, and we have 2 more questions. So
Christopher is also raising his fingers.
Okay, so 3 questions. Sorry. So let's take Zanli, then if we have time, we take Juan and Christopher.
Bruce, thanks for the talk. I was following I follow this group on and off. I was always a little bit puzzled about the scope of this topic. You know, the qualitative data, as you said, is almost many times are overlooked, and I totally agree. But also for the scope is, are we focusing on how to using the qualitative data to formalize the behavior rules, or do we cover the whole chain, like how to use the qualitative data to design, to formulate, to implement, to analyze data, how to validate with the qualitative thing, or using the qualitative data for applications.
There are lots of possibilities. The one that people have worked most on is to try and inform how we know what and why agents do things, because that's a huge area of our ignorance. We don't understand the human brain and human behavior. So personal qualitative accounts of why people do things are an obvious fix for that. So it fixes a hole. So most work has been done in that direction. But that's not the only possibilities. No, you're right.
We have reached the time allocated to Bruce, and we still have 2 questions, Juan and Christopher. But now the next speaker is Juliette, and she has to be at 11 o'clock in a different workshop. So I hope it's fine if we take Christopher's question and Juan's question at the end of the session, when we have time for when we have this interactive part of the workshop. Okay.
If people want to send me the questions directly, I will answer them in chat.
Yeah, that's also possible. So thank you very much, Bruce. Now we move to our keynote speaker, Juliette Rouchier. If I'm sorry if my French pronunciation is not the best. So Juliette works at the French National Center for Scientific Research, and she has been working both with agent-based modeling and qualitative data in her career, and we are very happy to have her with us today. So Juliette, the floor is yours now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My name is Hector today, because I had some problems with my own machine, and this is my son's machine. So yeah, I wanted to talk about this. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Bruce, for forcing me to think about these issues. Oh, this is not going to be very nice. Because of course the Quali-Quanti question is central and has been central for a long time in our discussions, but my feeling is that it's very good to bring it back, because when I was looking at papers that were more or less related to this issue, I just realized that they are quite old, and that a lot of them date back from the beginning of the diffusion of agent-based simulation, and are maybe a little bit less current discussions. I'm just looking for, yeah, that's it. In general, so I've been thinking in general, because I have lots of discussion with colleagues about when we are doing science or not. This is a real good discussion. Are we scientists or not? Are we doing science, or are we just talking nonsense, giving points of view, opinions that are not well founded? And this is a huge discussion, especially when you get into labs where there are many people doing quantitative sciences, and they think that if you don't use quantitative methods, then you're not doing science. And I'm facing that quite regularly. And so I'm going back to what I think is science, and also I would like to pass the message that I have huge difficulties in understanding the difference between qualitative and quantitative point of view in science. For me, science is just a way we found as humans collectively to accumulate knowledge about the world that is outside or even inside us, but that we tend to consider when we are doing science as something outside, like an object we can study coldly, and from which we have to separate to work on it. And so either we do, like, we try to know about it, or we try to act on it, and actually both are all the time always interlinked, like what I would call fundamental research and engineering. And in a way, fundamental research proves useful because engineering does work. So physics is good because you can send something on the moon. And so we are all the time in action and learning. So there's nothing really pure, okay, in science at no moment. It's always like going and coming back. And okay, what is usually expected at the end and what you learn when you do science at school, it's like three big things. First, you define what are the objects that are going to be meaningful. So do you want to study a human? Do you want to study its immune system only without anything else like consciousness or whatever? You just take the immune system, which is relevant. Or do you take a social group? Do you take institutions, the links between things that are meaningful, or is it just their state or their internal dynamics you want to study? So you have to focus on something which is the observed phenomena, which is of interest. And then you look for underlying explanation, things that you don't see. So usually you have to see under the surface so that to explain something that you have defined as something interesting. And to do that, either you simplify the story you're looking at, the story of the object, or you divide it in subsystems that explains some phenomena. You extract as one object and you just study this one so that this sub-object is going to explain everything you're observing here, whatever. But every time you're dealing with levels again. And then once you have an underlying explanation for one phenomena, you have to try to check if it's true everywhere. So if you can generalize this, and generalization is the point for generalization is that you have to make very explicit the law you are trying to generalize. Otherwise, you cannot say it's the same. So you have to define very clearly what the same is. And so that's with all these steps, maybe you will contest them, but that's the step I see in the process. Well, first, when you define the objects, I hardly see how you can do this with quantitative data. It's very rare that you observe something coming out of quantitative data that is obviously an object that has to be discussed. I guess it does happen to statisticians, but I doubt it's that often that you realize suddenly that there is a social group or whatever that you had never seen before, and this comes from quantitative data. usually what you need to do is to identify with your eyes as humans, and that's where I completely agree with Bruce on the idea that eventually humans have this ability, and not just humans, but most animals, let's say, to see the difference between two things, and then to decide that one thing is and one thing are there. And then you have to see this, identify the difference between things, and then qualify what is in front of you, what is the system, and what are the sub-elements of the system. And I can't see how this part of the definition can be not qualitative, or can be just quantitative. It's impossible for me to see how this definition of what is the space of organization can be made without qualitative. And then you have to find underlying explanations. And then you have two ways. Either you go through a qualitative exploration of the phenomena. So again, you look at one case and details, and you look at how things circulate within, for example, for the immune system, how the hormone circulates and information circulates within the body. And you look very carefully in one situation, and then you understand what can be the processes, or you use an explanation that is already existing somewhere else, and you test it on your situation. And this is the beginning of quantitative science for me. That's where you think this model can be applied to different, and by applying to different places, you get some regularity, some generalization of the fact that this explanation is a general law. Yeah, and for this, the qualitative aspect of the underlying explanation, I really like to refer to the word serendipity, where you really have to be all the time very ready to be aware of anything that's happening and that can explain something. And usually it comes with a surprise, because as I said, you're looking at something which is underlying, which is not what you expect usually, which is not common knowledge, which is not everyday point of view. And the generalization is also a quantitative process usually, again. So the underlying explanation can be a start of generalization, and then you have to generalize your own law anyway. So you have to think when it could apply, when it would not. So you have to define when you can test. And usually where you can test, you will start counting the cases. And you will start counting the differences, and you will start really specifying your law by counting the number of times you can say this is true, counting the number of times you can say your explanation is not applying. And then you can start really making the limit between where this generally applies and the way it does not apply. But if you don't do several things, several observations, I don't know how you can make any type of generalization. And what is interesting with this opposition of qualitative and quantitative is that some people are doing qualitative, but implicitly, I don't see how they can do without having a bit of quantitative in their mind. Because even if you do deep interviews, well, I mean, in social science, you do that qualitative. You say that qualitative is when you stay with someone, you make deep interviews, long observations, where you look a lot about context, details, and everything is very, very precise. You look at heterogeneity of things, different possibilities, etc. And you want to understand deeply. But if you're talking about a phenomena, it's because you think it's relevant. So you think it's a kind of generality, or you think it's completely original. But anytime it's made against something which is quantitatively regular. So even when you do qualitative, there is an implicit about the fact that you have a kind of belief that it is general. Although, or it is not general, but then you need to talk about it. And on the other side, and if you're not aware of that, I think there is a kind of a danger, although I did not express the danger here. I expressed the danger for quantitative social science, who would do the same, ignoring that they're using qualitative. Then most of the time, what I saw with people using data sets is that they don't know where the data sets come from. And sometimes they just realize the data set is wrong, but they still use it. It's like, I mean, a colleague who didn't use it, but who bought for economics. He bought some data from African GDP. And they had the Ivory Coast GDP, which was lower than one of its region GDP. And so it's inconsistent in the data set. This is one of the risks. It's like quantitative, if you don't take care about how it's made and what it is about, you can use data that are not relevant or even false. The surveys are very standardized, and they're not standardized on objects or using objects that are necessarily relevant to you. They're just standardized with common knowledge or administrative data, or I mean, most of the time I would say with common belief that people already have. And this is the real, if you don't realize that these categories you're using might not be the right category for your own work and your own type of research, this can be a bit annoying. So that's where I think that at any moment, quantitative and qualitative are discussing, and you cannot really do without remembering that they are there all the time. And also the problem that usually it's not the same people, as Bruce said. The one who know how to deal with data and make very nice analysis are not really the ones that are very good at looking at the world and seeing some regularities on very basic cases. So that's I think a major problem, and that's where the opposition comes from. But I don't see a real deep opposition, conceptual opposition within science for me. So if we, so that's it. The implicit unconscious. So for me, all robust knowledge we know has been a going and coming back from qualitative. And in qualitative analysis, you define data, then you do Quanti check, and then you have to interpret to know the limits where, when it applies and what. And this is qualitative. Where it applies, you need to define the context. The context is going to be verbal, very rarely is going to be numerical as well. And as Bruce said as well, and this is true for statistics, and this is true for many quantitative aspects, the work or the observation that define the object at the beginning cannot be used at the end for doing the interpretation and the validation. You need to get some more information all the time, so that the hypothesis cannot be just confirmed by what was used to do the hypothesis, which would be a bit self. Okay. So the problem with ABM is that anyway, we cannot do, we cannot do without numbers. At some point, there are numbers, especially if you use NetLogo, just because you have to put your animals on the grid and you give them numbers just to find places. And then you can calculate distances, and many things are already there that are just calculus. That are one choice of the distance that has been put into NetLogo. And so actually what we're doing usually when we do ABM is that, for me, we are just slaloming all the time with the expressivity of mathematical representation, and we have to use it as a signal for us to understand things. And we are all the time translating into numerical things that are not very easy or spontaneously numeric for us. And I've been thinking about the opinion dynamics. So why opinion dynamics? It took me years to accept to use opinion dynamics. And because I'm very interested in influence. And I hated, I don't hate anymore, but I hated all these opinion dynamics models, because I was all the time thinking, but what are they talking about? This is not an opinion. You cannot define an opinion on such silly scales. Nobody would recognize something that is called an opinion, which is complex and rich, in these scales, whatever the scales were used for. And so since I didn't like them, I used them a lot. And what I find is that they are all the time, they're extremely frustrating. They are using our ability to just go from identification of shape to giving meaning, to calculating. I mean, for me, they are very, very good place for this Quali-Quanti permanent dancing that we are doing. So I have three small examples. Maybe I will tell only one, because I don't know if time is not running too fast. Okay, it's the an Epstein example, which was published in Computational Economics. I mean, the three examples I took in are very different ways of representing opinion. Epstein has two states, either you're left or you're right. And what you do is that you count the number of agents that are around you and who have the same opinion as you, have a different opinion from you, and then you align to the majority, on the majority. And what he does is interesting, as I will say, that he varies the information. So whenever you agree with the majority, and if you were taking more information, you would agree with the majority again, then you don't have to take too much information. What he wants to show is that the more everybody agrees, the less people think about their opinion, and they just reinforce their opinion without taking any information. And it's a nice small model for that. Axelrod is also very interesting in his original, old paper, where we have a representation of culture, which is with multi-trait and values. So there is an aspect which is interesting, which is in these two cases, the opinion is not a number. I mean, or even if it's a number, it's a code. So you have to find similarities or dissimilarities. And Desfranc has a continuous opinion model. I mean, Desfranc, Weisbusch, Chamblat, they have a continuous opinion model that they have developed in time. And where I see a real question in this Quanti-Quali question is in the identification of clusters, which is, again, identifying clusters with numbers is going to be numerical and not using our qualitative abilities. But again, you have to build numerical aspects that help our qualitative view. So all the time we will have to create patterns to be able to observe them or to integrate patterns. Epstein has a model in Computational Economics 2000 where each agent has a radius of observation. So we are in a circle and we observe our neighbors. And with the neighbor, you first look at, if I look at 6 neighbors and if I look at more, like 8 neighbors, do I get the same information? If I don't get the same information, I will look at more people, more agents, and I will do what the larger number of agents does. If ever getting more information is not necessarily good for me, I will reduce the information I'm getting. So instead of looking at 3 agents, I will look at 2 agents. And I will see if this is not changing the global information I'm getting, like what I should choose in life, being left or right. And in this case, I have to check 2 times the equality of the number of the share of agents that think like me. And of course, when he's doing his model, so here the opinion is just correspondence. So either you are or you are not the same. However, knowing how many people are the same or not relies on a fraction. And the fraction, of course, we all know because we have done math, is never exactly the same. 3/4, 2/3, 0.6666666. You don't have equality. And so here he's working on opinions which are strict, but suddenly he needs to count people, and suddenly you cannot, it doesn't fit anymore. You cannot say 2 things are equal. The number of people I'm observing, it's not, the share of people, it's not equal. So you need to find the tolerance level. And the tolerance level starts to be the new relevant, in his model, a new relevant parameter That was not thought about. It's like usually you can say, oh, you look at the majority of people and you follow them. This is very simple. But when you want to actualize it in the model, you have to put a tolerance saying, is it the same share if I look at 8 agents who say left and right? And if I look at 10 agents who say left and right? Do I have the same share of people? And this share, I have to accept similarity and dissimilarity because the numbers will not fit because they are numbers and they're much more complex than our pattern analysis, or complex or simple, but they cannot give the same information. And so he, okay, so on the left of the picture, you can see the idea that people are black or white, left or right, left and right. And what you see that the radius in this work is evolving all the time. So they are learning to look for more information or less information. And what is the expression of this representation? So you see that when the norm is black, you have next to it the radius is also, so the time is like that when you read this scheme, also this result. Time is vertical, and you see the norm for one agent, it's one line. So the agents are black all the time, or white all the time, black all the time. So they don't change, except for, and if you look at the radius being black means it's one. So you just get one information from one on each side of the agents, and you check that they do the same as you all the time. After a bit of learning, when you have been checking, do I get more information or less information, etc. So if people don't change, what he shows in his model is that those at the frontier between two groups, those who are left and right, all the time take information, reduce information, take more information, take less information, and so they're all the time adapting, learning. This is the model. So they are not changing their opinion, but they're securing their opinion by looking at other agents all the time. And so this is what he's working on. So the radius is his observation. When we have a radius of 1, it means that we are not learning anymore. We are not looking for, agents are not looking for information all the time. And so this is his observable. Its radius is how much information our agent taking all the time. And the expressions of the tolerance, which is what I said, it's like, when do agents consider that the group is thinking like him, or the share of people is the same as with more information? It depends on the tolerance level, which is on the right. So if you have a very low tolerance level and you think that 2 share of people are different, if 3 out of 4 and 3 out of 5, that's different. I'm giving example of number. That's not this calculus precisely, but if you think that 3 out of 4 and 3 out of 5 is different, then you will have to get more information because 3 out of 5 is more interesting, etc., etc. So you will get all the time more information, and what you can see that the radius is going to increase because 2 opinion or 2 share of opinions are hardly ever the same. And on the opposite, if you are very open-minded as an agent and you think that 2 groups are 9 out of 20, 10 out of 20, it's pretty much the same, then you're reducing your interest in getting information and you keep a radius the same. But what I found very interesting is that in this model, the problem that emerges for representing what is agent is to think similarity and dissimilarity, which is the same as what I said was the basic of qualitative thinking. So in his model, doing purely quantitative analysis, you just get a qualitative question coming out, which is a qualitative question which is good for everyone at every moment. Okay, I have to accelerate a lot. So that's where I'm saying I'm not going to show, but I had also questions of the same times, same like what is this to have clusters, like to say that something is the same or not, which is again a mathematical problem. Every time the similarity and dissimilarity is going to be a problem. The other aspect I wanted to say about quantitative is that we have natural quantitative questions, because we can do the sensitivity analysis. We have to do the sensitivity analysis. We can repeat that to check if with the same initial situation, we only have one path, or if we are path dependent. And so this, and there are some people advising either to standardize this representation or to make a lot of different models that are supposed to address the same object and dynamics, but with different bases, so that to compare them. Okay, but at the end, if we multiply, what we realize is even, okay, if I was a bit criticizing the opinion models, and I showed that I'm not criticizing them anymore because I think they are raising very interesting questions. What you can do also with the multiplication of experiments is that you can show that there are commonalities in all this, even with different formalism, which are every time very weird when you look at formalism for opinion diffusion. I mean, very weird in interpretation. So you have the, especially the polarization that occurs all the time, which is interesting because you make agents imitate themselves. It's what Axel would remark. You had to do local imitation all the time, and imitation brings to general to polarization, so you cannot imitate anymore. So the more you imitate, you get to a state where you can imitate only part of the agents and not the other. And then you get some very, very large results, which are the influence of size, the influence of network, like that multi-dimensional opinions have different dynamical patterns when you, okay, so that there are things that are meta-knowledge that we have now about all these opinion dynamic systems. And this is where it's getting interesting. It's also qualitative knowledge rising for the multiplication, so numerical multiplication of quantitative analysis, I would say. Okay, this I'm not going to talk either. For the classical Quali, and that's where I'm getting, I think that anyway, agent-based is a Quali tool, qualitative tool. I'm sorry to say that. I think it is really not suitable for quantitative analysis. And one reason is the sensitivity to parameters, massive sensitivity to small parameters. And, but we have many emergent features which are established already, but very useful and can be repeated in many places and can be tested everywhere. So that they are kind of theories within ABM, the fact that there are self-fulfilling prophecies, the congestion system that can arise in very different contexts and complex systems, the reinforcement, which is occurring at different scale, like from individual to the group, and in very different occasions and type of system. Also, there's one I was thinking about, which is the idea that one-side learning, if you have agents learning on something that is stable, is infinitely easier to conceptualize than if agents are learning on something that is moving at the same time and adapting to the agent's actions. So this is also a regularity. And of course, all I said up until now has already been said hundreds of times, especially if we get back to pattern-oriented modeling by Volker Grimm. You get all these questions of identifying patterns and selecting entities and testing theories using quantitative patterns to identify qualitative regularities. And here on the picture, you can see that there are quantitative representation, which are the maps, which help us to understand the patterns. And so anytime you have to deal about patterns with quantitative, at the end, you need them to be possible to perceive for humans. Okay, now we have machine learning, but I'm not sure we are still at the moment where machine learning can inform back agent-based models. Also, the last problem we have with this use of Quanti all the time visit our Quali life is that the numbers have a life. And there was a very nice paper called Ghost in the Model, which was showing that the very fact that we use numbers and equality and inequality, blah, 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 can suddenly make an agent appear that was not designed in the system. And also I wanted to refer to an architect whose name is Jonas Brinkmann, and who shows very nicely in complicated order this question of how just the scale, if you choose a scale between 0 and 1, x squared will not have the same type of dynamic as if you choose a scale between 0 and 10, and it can have very large implication in your calculus. So
Juliette, I'm sorry, I'll have to intervene a bit just so you know that we have to wrap it up.
I'm finishing.
Good.
So I didn't talk about numerical fitting. And I guess that people are going to be very happy. But I think that numerical fitting, it's just good not to eliminate model, not to prove that a model is of interest. So that's not the best way to relate Quali and Quanti for me. But as I said, for me, ADM is qualitative anyway. And but we cannot do without quantitative abilities. So that's the main problem for us, I would say, especially to recruit students. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juliette. So let's see, maybe we have time for one question before Juliette has to go to the other workshop.
I'm not going, I have to.
Oh, you're not going, okay.
I have 20 minutes, I can listen to one person.
Okay, so let's take one question. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Susanne.
Hello, I have one question regarding, in one of your slides, you said all the qualitative data have to somehow in the end translate to a number. So if that means to utilize the qualitative data, we actually have to just essentially how to translate this qualitative data into quantitative data. So in the end, in the model, we have to use quantitative data directly, maybe indirectly from the qualitative data, but in the end, you have to do a translation. Is that what you mean there?
Okay, this was a bit of exaggeration, but you can keep a representation that will be qualitative in your model. But as I said with Epstein, and which interesting bit is that it's a very simple model. He does everything with the idea of qualitative matching, but suddenly after he has elaborated his model, there is some quantitative getting in. Because at some point you have to say this is above and under a limit. And usually above and under a limit is with an inequality. Or, and so at some point there is somewhere in our models, I've never seen a model where you don't have an inequality somewhere or a test that would be numerical. That's me, maybe I missed something. And I found a paper from 1998, which was about qualitative modeling. I've been looking at it, it's in JAS. So when I was saying it's in the old discussions, there was much more of these qualitative questions and qualitative observations getting in. So but I could, to be very honest, I could not understand everything in this paper. So I have, maybe they have only qualitative manipulation of elements. Maybe, but I don't think that's what is done at the moment. And
thank you. I think this is a good question to discuss. So whether we have to translate the qualitative data into quantitative data. Maybe in some stage it's not necessary.
May I jump on this, Melania?
Well,
okay,
I don't know. So I'm the chair. I should take decisions. I'm the one with the pause button on the recording. So very quick, Nanda, just jump in, and then Juan had a comment, I think, and then we have to wrap it up.
I just wanted to say that I'm not sure I fully understood, but for me, using qual is not always linked to having to, in the end, translate it to a number. So when I design a model and I use qualitative data, it might just give me hints what factors to include. So who my agents are, maybe what relations they have with each other. But digging deeper, I might use other data for that. So I guess I didn't fully understand.
I mean, you never ever put any numbers that are in relation to other numbers through an equation.
Of course, but that I don't see what the point is to. I know every model has numbers, but what is the point of having to say that that is the case? Because I think we all know that. But the fact that you use qualitative information to design your model doesn't necessarily have to relate to a particular number. So I guess I just don't understand why that is important to say that that qualitative data always leads to a number.
Because there are properties when you deal with numbers that will constrain your way of dealing with your data, with your model. And if you are not aware that numbers have an action or equations have relative actions on your hypothesis and the object you're moving in your model, you might get failed by a trick which is purely numerical and so Quanti, and that comes and disturbs your interpretation. So that's where all the time you have to be very aware that there is a numerical life that can have an impact on your quality in ABM. I mean.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. But still, if I choose to say I define who are my agents, like I use farmers and fishers because that's what the data is telling me. What would be the risk there then that I should take into account? What do I not see?
That's not a question of risk. It's the difference between an ABM and a talk. If you're talking about things, you keep on telling stories that are not actually computed and calculated, but you're relying on something which is calculation. And so the patterns that are emerging is what you are able to observe with numerical analysis. So you need this ability to take curves, maps, whatever, and this is a numerical translation. If you don't know you're using a numerical translation and it has constraints and it has underlying hypotheses, like when you make a map with data, there are underlying hypotheses about distances and how they are defined. Then if you don't know that, then you can be tricked. That's all. I'm not saying you have to have a full conscious, but that's where you have to try maybe several representations to see if they get different patterns, or several mapping, or several distances, like several type of representation of your space, whatever. But you cannot assume that there is neutrality in the use of numbers.
Sure, that point is taken. And I think I also understand that we are talking on different levels. So you talk about the overall model and at some point some qual comes in, and I talk about specific elements in the model. So there's a level of detail that we can talk on how we use the data we use. But
and maybe you can take then this discussion further, maybe in private. But let's take now Juan's comment. And then Juliette, there is a question from Bruce in the chat. So before going to your other workshop, maybe please take some time to answer that question. But we're going to wrap up this part after Juan's comment.
No, thank you. But it's more a question, or it was most a discussion about something that Bruce said. And
yeah,
okay, thank you. It's about the protocol, but I guess it's also related with the discussion we were having. Is okay, we're trying to get this qualitative information into quantitative. How do we do, what's the protocol? How can we think about a protocol or a more standardized way in which we can validate and not, because we cannot be unrespectful with the qualitative methodologies when we translate that into numbers or into what, so how do you think, or what's some examples of this protocols of transforming qualitative data into numbers and quantitative?
It's difficult. There are lots of people have ideas. I must say that not all, it's a very creative act to do that translation at the moment, and it is certainly protocols and ideas about how to do that in a more systematic way are only just emerging in certain circumstances, where there are several groups trying to go back and collect examples from the literature and by interviewing researchers on how they did this. But those aren't out yet, coming out soon, I hope.
Okay, this being said, we have to wrap up the session here. Thank you very much, Juliette, for your talk. We are going to take a break now for 3 minutes. So we'll start around 10-12 minutes past 11. I will pause the recording now and resume when we come back. Welcome back, everybody, to the second part of our workshop. We will continue now with a presentation by Stephanie Dorschneider from University College Dublin in Ireland. She's going to talk about building bridges, connecting ethnography to agent-based modeling. Please, Stephanie.
Okay, thanks. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Can you see me? Can you see the screen, Melania?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So thanks, first of all, for inviting me to give a talk on this panel. And what I will do is to say a few words about a collaboration which I have with Bruce and about which some of you will have heard in previous meetings. So the talk is entitled Building Bridges, Connecting Ethnography to ABM. And basically what we are doing in this collaboration is to build an ABM informed by ethnographic qualitative research. And as you can easily guess, I'm the person conducting the qualitative ethnographic research, and Bruce is the person who then wrote an ABM informed by this research. And maybe just to quickly say what this ethnographic research is about. So at the time I was doing interviews with people who participated in the Arab Spring in Egypt and Morocco. And Bruce and I then had several discussions, meetings, and based on that, he wrote an ABM integrating the main findings from the qualitative research and also some preliminary qualitative analysis. So we have actually already given a presentation about how this model was written and what role the qualitative evidence played. So I'm not going to repeat that. That's in the conference proceedings of last year's conference. But rather I wanted to say a little bit about what has happened since. So as we said last year, we were going to apply this model as a next step. And I wanted to tell you about a first application, which we have presented recently last month in a conference by political scientists, ECPR, it's a European Conference of Political Scientists. We were on a panel for political psychologists, nobody familiar with ABM among this crowd. And what I will do now in the following slides is to tell you a little bit about the subject of this application. And then I thought it might be helpful to say a little bit about how this talk was received. And so Melania asked me to come up with some questions or discussion points. I have some reflections of what I think were some key challenges and opportunities for the application of BM are. So as you can see from the slide, so this is just a screenshot from the conference. We applied the model to a field which is very close to my research. I'm a political scientist, and that is the state dissident nexus. Now I have just one slide to very briefly tell you what this research is about. So it's a really a huge field of the literature with a long tradition dating back to at least the 1970s. And basically what this research does is to examine state dissident interaction with a special eye to repression. And we have large numbers of empirical studies, mostly large N studies, which have established that typically if we see dissent, this generates repression. So this relationship is uncontested. However, if we look at the reverse relationship and check for the effects of repression on dissent, we are still decades after this research field began left with a research puzzle. So we have on the one hand a large field of the literature arguing that repression has a spurring effect on dissent. And on the other hand, we have an equally large field of the literature telling us that repression has a dampening effect on dissent. And this is where Bruce and my research now comes in. So as I said, most of this research is based on large N studies. And what we now bring to this field is ABM, which to my knowledge had not been done before. So what can ABM contribute to this field of the literature, which is already pretty large? So we can complement existing studies by focusing on the micro-level dynamics of state-dissident interactions, focusing on individuals, the agents in the model. And we can also suddenly start to simulate repression effects. And in this first application, we disaggregate between different types of repression, which is not typically done in the literature. So we differentiate between violent state attacks on dissidents, travel restrictions imposed by the government, curfews, and internet cuts. And as I said earlier in the first slide about building bridges, our ABM is based on a real environment where dissent and repression actually happened. That was the Arab Spring context of the Egyptian and Moroccan Arab Spring, where I collected individual level data in the form of interviews. What we did in our ABM, in addition to these contributions, was to integrate the key finding of my prior qualitative study, and that was a key role of emotions that were played in mobilization of individuals. And this is an additional contribution to the literature on state dissident interactions, which is usually ignorant of the emotional context. Now, just briefly to show you what we found before I then jump to the reception. So we found that applying an ABM grounded in empirical research supports this literature arguing that repression dampens dissent. And we find some micro-level evidence. So first of all, we find that the biggest dampening effect is related to street blockages. So literally the government blocking streets, as opposed to violent state attacks or internet cuts, which are typically assumed to have strong dampening effects. We found, to our surprise, no evidence for what is called the inverted U hypothesis, according to which protests are expected to increase together with state violence, but then to decline at a certain threshold. We did not find this. We really found dampening effects in most instances. And then we had one last important findings, and that was that at very low levels of state violence, there may be a non-linear effect where dissent may be spurred initially before it then starts to dampen. Now, if you're not working on this field, you might wonder, so what's the point? So this is now about the reception of this research from people who actually specialize in this literature. So first of all, it was recognized that there's real value in applying ABM to this field, which is really more or less a minefield. Hundreds of studies conducted, still we have this puzzle about the effect of repression on dissent. And by applying ABM, we now suddenly have new chances to model this relationship at the micro level and to also simulate the effect of repression, which was very much welcome. There was surprise about the finding that repression dampens the effect, dampens dissent in most instances. Now, to you, this might seem intuitive, but if you're familiar with the literature, it's actually really not. There are many convincing arguments backed up by empirical evidence that we should observe the opposite relationship. Then, especially among psychologists, there was a huge interest in ABM, and that, from my understanding, what I gathered was mostly due to the focus of individuals that psychologists have. So they have an interest in how individuals act and behave in interaction with each other. And then there was also an interest in applying ABM to other fields. For example, there was a paper on the evolution of trust. And then there was also literature studying state interactions, which could potentially also apply ABM. Now, I reflected on challenges and opportunities, and here I came up with 3 as asked, but here's my key challenge, and which is at the same time also an opportunity. So I think the key challenge when dealing with people who are not applying ABM is to communicate how it works. So in this particular panel, I think what is generally missing when we're talking about political psychology is some overview article, ideally, of course, placed in a key journal like Political Psychology, telling us, well, here's what ABM can contribute. This is how ABM would allow us to study key concepts such as trust or ideology. So I thought here's really an opportunity that is maybe not yet taken for the particular field of political psychology, but my hunch is that the same is true for other fields where I'm not a specialist in. And then I think visualizations of how the model works are key. So I got loads of questions at the end. Yeah, how does this work? How does that work? I tried, Bruce will remember this, I tried to create a visualization of the many different components of our model by using the dot language prior to the conference. This you will appreciate is hard to walk someone through in a conference talk limited to 10 minutes. So maybe better to put in a paper, but this general problem of how do we communicate to outsiders, how the model then in its nitty-gritty details actually works so that we can get a better understanding of the results. To me, these 2 points seem kind of key. And then I have just 2 more points that might be of interest, which I've come across in earlier workshops with you guys. So one relates to the model justification. So a continuing question that was also clear from this conference presentation with a psychologist was, so which findings of the qualitative research did you integrate into the model and which ones did you leave? So supposedly not everything should be integrated, but some. So there were questions about, well, how about focusing on psychological factors as opposed to structural factors? And how much context do we need that exceeds what was available from the qualitative studies? And then finally, we also got some questions about or comments more on the main contribution of the model. So should the contribution be to open up ABM and explain to psychologists, so here's how you can design an ABM for this literature? And maybe other questions, for example, what are the overlaps between the original qualitative findings and then the findings that we obtained later from the simulations? And then for the protest literature, which was the main focus in this particular presentation, well, do you want to make this a real contribution about, well, what ultimately can we learn about the state dissident nexus and the effect of repression on dissent? And then related topics to explore more substantially, and Bruce and I are currently working on this, would be tipping point theory. So we can simulate populations with different numbers and then see when do protests pick up as opposed to turn down. But I think I said what I wanted to say. I will stop here and see if there are any questions. Should I stop sharing, Melania, or maybe yes?
Yeah, just stop sharing. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's see if there are any questions. Juan, please.
Sorry, but I'm very curious because this is an example of how you use, and you said that maybe you will not stay on that because you had it in another paper or something, but I would like to know a little bit more in concrete. How did you transform your qualitative ethnographic research into the ABM? Like how did you do it? That's, I think I'm very curious about.
Can I answer, Melania, or should I wait?
Yes, no, please answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks for this question. So we gave a presentation just dedicated to this last year at ESSA, so that's why I didn't give too much detail. Basically, Bruce and I sat down over weeks and months, and I did a preliminary study of the qualitative data where I identified some of the key rules for individuals. So this was, as I said, individual level data. I did interviews with people who participated in the uprisings or stayed at home. And then I coded the ethnographic interviews with decisions to participate or to stay at home at the endpoints. And then we had a bunch of reasoning belief systems or reasoning processes antecedent to these decisions, from which we abstracted some of the key rules. There were hundreds of rules, but we focused on those that seemed key. And Bruce also added some important information about context. Yeah, I think that's the level where I'll leave it. If you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to ask. But there are lots and lots of rules based on the main findings of this research. And I think one of the main values of this module is that it manages to incorporate really quite a lot. So the level is quite detailed, but not every rule from the interviews is integrated.
Okay, thank you. Martin, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm very curious. First of all, thanks for this presentation. And my question, basically, I'm very curious about how did you communicate, or I was surprised that you're with qualitative researchers, because that's also something which I'm struggling with at the moment. And that I was surprised that you said visualization is helpful, and in particular this complex graphs that you showed us. I was surprised that they could grasp or comprehend what the meaning of this graph. So
yeah, they couldn't, and I decided against showing it. So this was just for you. I did not include it in the conference because it has too much detail and it will confuse. I thought it would, and Bruce, we discussed this. Yeah, it was in the paper, the conference paper, but not in the presentation. In the presentation, we then had simulation results, etc., to summarize the main findings for the field. But I think in principle, so I'm a qualitative researcher mainly, and I would like to publish this now in some journal. I think it would be key for any qualitative researcher then to communicate, well, actually, how did this work? I always find when I come to these workshops, it's great. With you, you already know what is happening, how this works. But if so I got questions. So what is this? So I had to really go back and explain what is ABM to someone who's working on the evolution of trust. Yeah, so I was just thinking about that this could be interesting for this community. So how to communicate this? It seems to be a case of how to communicating how particular models work. So this visualization was an attempt, but also more broadly speaking, to fields like political psychologists, so I'm not aware of any article in a leading psychology journal introducing ABM to this crowd.
Yes, Nanda.
I was wondering whether you saw any, like for instance in jazz, some publications where you thought these visualizations were very informative for you, because it's for us, I mean, well, let's speak for myself. I always use visualizations because I'm a very visually oriented person, but it doesn't mean that makes sense to that audience particularly. So it might be good to use yourself as being part of that audience to look through the journal and see whether you find certain model visualizations about the inner workings useful. I don't know, have you seen something?
Sorry. I found Bruce's CSNE framework very helpful. So that's what we worked with, and also that's what we also had in our previous presentations. I think so the model visualizations that I've seen, they vary a lot. Most of them, they give you screenshots maybe of functions of a certain relationship works, but to really have the nitty-gritty details of how one particular ABM works, I haven't seen. I'm not sure it's necessary. This was sort of a discussion point. And in jazz, I find jazz incredibly helpful for a political psychologist, for instance. Most of them would not read it, so it might really be good to share. I don't know if articles can be shared across journals, but if there was some interest, I know that there are some other people working in this field as well. That would definitely be, I think, welcomed by that community.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, Pierre, there's a very short question. We can take it now. You are on mute.
Sorry, you talked about transparency and that the ABM was perceived as being a more transparent kind of method. Can you say a little bit more about that? Or did I?
So I did not mean that it was more transparent than other methods. So I think the main contribution for this crowd was really to move away from these large N studies, where you really unpack what is going on with the individual and state interaction. So the individual agent exposed to these repressive measures.
But people trusted the ABM.
Yeah,
that's what I understood from your talk.
Yes, that's true. But I'm not sure this trust was based on me explaining every rule in the model, if that makes sense. So we did have this visualization in the paper, which captured most rules, but not all. But yeah, they trusted the logic of ABM.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. Can you please also look at the chat and see if there are any questions for you that you can answer? Thank you. Then we move to the next point in our workshop, which is a presentation by Martin Neumann on the hermeneutic interpretation of simulation results. So Martin, now the audience is yours.
Yes, thanks, Melania. I just try to share the screen. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. So I would like to talk about a little bit different aspects, namely I call it hermeneutic interpretation of simulation results. This builds very heavily on prior research. As I see that many or some of the participants already had been last year at our Quality Rule workshop at the Social Simulation Conference last year. There we showed this method more in detail. It was research on criminal groups, so most of what I say will be about criminals, but the talk here is intended to be methodological. So we developed a method to derive narrative scenarios from simulation results. So it was a methodology to develop simulation models from qualitative data analysis originally, and to trace the simulation results back to the annotations which come from the qualitative data analysis. And the annotations then correspond to the rules which are fired during a simulation run. And thus, in the end, is a sequence of annotations of the rules that are fired during a simulation run generate a story. So this is our prior research. And you see here, the screenshot is the model explorer that has been developed by my colleague Ulf, where you see on the very left-hand side, the document view is just the textual data or primary input data. And then what's called the CCD viewer. These are the rules that have been generated from the qualitative data analysis. And you see here in yellow in the document view, one highlighted example of a text phrase. And these are then the annotations that are related to the rules that we derived from this, of our simulation model, that we derived from the analysis. In the middle of the big screen is this trace graph visualization. These are basically the rules that have been fired during a particular simulation run. And on the very right-hand side, you see the simulation log. These are then the sequences of rules that have been fired during a simulation run. And if you put the annotations to every rule together, in the sequence, as these rules had been fired during a simulation run, then the story develops. So this is basically the background of our prior research, which was enabled us to develop stories. But then the question obviously remained, yeah, so what? And obviously a story can be subject of qualitative interpretation for decoding sense making. And the specific method that we used, just because I had a colleague in mind who is a specialist in this kind of method, is a methodology called sequence analysis. It has been developed in the research program of so-called objective hermeneutics by Ulrich Overmann, who is a qualitative researcher. And the method basically is a kind of group discussions where you sequence by sequence discuss what possible follow-up sequence would be possible. Another rule is that you don't take knowledge into account, context knowledge into account in the first instance. So one example, for instance, would be greeting. A says hello to B, and certainly a possible follow-up sequence would then be B says hello to A. But certainly there can also be disruptions. you might only think of the corona effect on the habit of shaking hands. And what I want to say finally is that typically the unit of what is a sequence is typically less than a sentence. And the result of the overall methodology is then what Ulrich Oebermann calls the decoding of latent meaning structures of the social world. And in the next slide here, I want to give you just an example of how our simulation results look like. This is an example of not the full simulation run, but this is a sequence of a simulation run. And I just give you a minute to read this, perhaps. But it's perhaps not so important, the content of the story, because I now would like to focus on the methodology and to just give you an example of how our interpretation work went on. So this is not the full, I cannot present you the full interpretation because it's a very time-consuming process. So the first starting sequence of our analysis was the word while. The overall story starts with the word while. And this is an announcement of an alleged contradiction. Namely, this one guy, we call them WC, accepted that demands are justified on the one hand, but on the other hand, intimidation was too much. So there was a mismatch between content of the demand and the enforcement of the demand. Then we also discussed that it could be perhaps in a formal setting. For instance, an employer wants a certification for sickness, or in an informal sentence, for instance, when lending money to a friend. And then the method goes on by using the factual follow-up sequences for deciding between possible interpretations of the sequence. The follow-up sequence then was he secretly contacted the police. And interpreting this means that we found out that there was an expectation. Why did he do that? An expectation that the counterpart could use illegal means. For instance, something which we found in the data was threatening of family members. So this is just an example how this sequence analysis works. And now I would like to go on to show you the results of our interpretation, which is a synopsis of the overall sequences. And in particular, we concentrated on interpreting WC's sequences of actions. And in reading all these sequences together in the synopsis, we called this sequences of actions by WC as a strategy, namely a strategy to maintain normative bindings both to the illegal world as well as to the legal world. And at the same time, this WC is acting also on the relationship patterns within the illegal group in order to improve his strategic position in the group. So here we have identified a strategy, which is a sequences of actions which are meaningfully related to each other. And what is interesting is that this strategy has not been found in the data, and neither did we implement this strategy in the model. But it was a simulation result of our narrative, but this could only be conceived through interpreting the narrative. So the strategy is a kind of virtual innovation, so to say an emergent property of the simulation run. But we thought in our last step of interpretation, when we now finally took context into account, that this kind of strategy could be possible in the context of the criminal group, because these were really very nasty, self-interested guys, basically. So this is the result. What could be achieved from this interpretation of the simulation narratives is, on the one hand, a kind of validation of simulation runs in terms of meaningfulness of the virtually generated action. Namely, the strategy is an example of sense-making in the sense that it is a course of actions which are meaningfully related to each other. But if it is meaningful, depends certainly on the certain specific cultural context. Would be, I guess, completely different in Morocco or in Egypt, for instance, what is meaningful. So it enables us to explore the space of possibilities within a certain cultural context. Because the strategy has not been explored in reality, but we thought that it is conceivable to be realized, that someone could have invented such a strategy. Then I wanted to show you a second example, but I guess in order to have more time for discussion and to avoid conflicts with our chair, I think I skipped this example. I wanted to use it because this is a kind of different way of using the simulation results, because it enabled us to help identifying critical junctures in the processes that are described in the real world data. So it helped us for a kind of process tracing of really what was going on in the real world. But now I would like to just wrap up to have time for discussion. So what are possible uses of interpreting simulation results? And the one what I could not show you was this process tracing of real-world processes, and in the other hand, validation of simulation in terms of meaningfulness of the simulations, which is so far, I would say, has not been done within ABM studies. So my question is, what is the scope of application? Certainly, criminals are just an example, but I would say it's about cultural studies. And my question to you is, what could be other useful scopes of applications? And a further question would be mostly related to this idea of using simulation for process tracing. My question then is, mostly I would say to qualitative researchers, does simulation provide added value to directly interpreting qualitative data? I would say yes, but maybe qualitative researchers have other opinions. And certainly I'm also interested in your questions or in other questions. So that was my presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention. And I hand over to Melania.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you. Okay, so let's see. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, Juan, please.
First, thank you, Stephanie. I didn't say thank you for the presentation, so thank you. And Martin, thank you for the presentation. I want to understand a little bit the process that you were discussing, and is that basically what you are trying to do is you are giving meaning to the interactions that are being made by the model. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and this meaning is, because if it's hermeneutical, I guess, is this meaning, how do you construct this meaning? Is this a meaning that you are ascribing? How do you use the interviews, or how do you use qualitative data to create those meanings into these interpretations? How does that process work?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that. This was topic of last year's presentation.
I missed it, apparently.
Basically, it's using we use the grounded theory approach. That is, and then the meaning comes from the textual data. We had police interrogations, about 1,000 pages of police interrogations, and then we made annotations where we thought these are very crucial actions which are decisive for interpreting the data. And these text passages, which are the annotation, these go then into the annotations of the rules of our agent-based model. Yeah, that go in the rules. And so when a rule is fired, at tick 25 of a simulation run, we can, at the 25th position of the simulation run, we can just place these textual annotations and can make a collage of the original text. So the meaning comes from the data, from its natural language data. This is more or less sufficient. Okay. I think Bruce.
Sorry, yes, Bruce.
Was it obvious when you had to add in contextual elements and when you didn't, or did that take a lot of thought? And if so, have you any idea about the criteria for that, when you would do it and when you wouldn't?
Well, I relied there on my colleague who is a specialist for this objective hermeneutics. And the general rule is, in the first instance, put context out and just think about the word while without taking context into account. And when you have gone through all that sequence by sequence, then you put again the context into account. And I was quite puzzled that our simulation run generates strategies, which is certainly something which is quite related to sense making. Is this sufficient?
Martin, are you publishing this research, or is it already published?
We submitted it to a hermeneutics journal, and we got feedback from the editors that they find it very, very interesting, but they, at the middle of the text, they couldn't understand the word anymore.
Okay. Well, I hope that you'll manage to publish somewhere so we can share your thoughts with the ABM community. Because of course we can share this recording and the slides, but still it would be nice to have a published paper.
Yeah, certainly. We just finished writing just 4 weeks ago or a few weeks ago. It is German, the journal, I have to admit, and I would have wanted to communicate also to qualitative researchers. But certainly I would like to publish also somehow in JAS also where.
Okay, good luck.
Thanks.
So if there are there any other questions or comments on Martin's presentation? If not, I know in the program we have a break now, but since we are a bit late, we are 10 minutes behind our schedule. I think we could just start with our next presenter, Sukaina Baklani, from the Oxford Center in the UK. She's going to talk about adding value to social simulation models using qualitative evidence. And I see that Sukaina is already prepared, so I'll give the floor to you, Sukaina.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melania. Hi, everyone. My name is Sukaina Baklani. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute based in Oxford in the UK. I want to preface this talk by saying I'm an anthropologist by training, but I am interested in linking qualitative and quantitative data to explain behavior and decision-making, particularly in the domain of climate change adaptation. I think many of you have probably heard about the process I'm going to describe today, so I won't go into a lot of detail about the tool or the case study, but I just wanted to use this experience as an example to reflect on why qualitative data is so important for social simulation models, and also why not all qualitative data provides the richness as well as the rigor that is needed to maximize the use of such models. And I think our experience in this and other cases is still relevant for the discussion that's happening today, even though it's not that recent anymore. So I think it's already been mentioned quite a lot this morning that the reasons why qualitative evidence is useful in ABMs is because often we lack transparency on how rules are designed and why they've been included in models. There's often not a lot of feedback about the validation of the model rules and how they've been validated. And there's also not a lot of documentation about the procedure used so that this is repeatable. So it doesn't mean that this isn't always done in the models that the community is developing, but it's sometimes just a result of poor documentation, a lack of explanation, or just a lack of transparency generally. So for the field of transdisciplinary climate change and sustainability research in which I work, ABMs can be particularly useful because they represent the spatial scales at which we work and see a lot of complexity from the local to the global, including human behavior, but also impacts such as land use and climate change impacts. It's very valuable to be able to model different time horizons from the short to the long term. But also from a transdisciplinary perspective, it's very useful to look at multiple goals and preferences of a variety of stakeholders and to model different knowledge types. Learning from peers is obviously really important, and looking at the impacts of different policy interventions. But nevertheless, as a social scientist, for me, the degree to which these can still represent the complexity that we see when we are in different contexts and in the field, as opposed to just being vehicles for dialogue, is still in question. Models that can provide nuanced insights into decision-making behavior of different groups and identify further areas for research, however, such as supporting organizations to plan capacity building initiatives or helping cities trying to mainstream adaptation to their development planning, would be of great value. And these are two areas in which I work. So I'm really interested to hear your feedback on how the link between modelers and social scientists can be improved. So what's missing in doing this so far is a richer understanding of the behavior at the micro level, for example, the household level, to inform what might happen at the system level, whether it be the community, city, regional landscape. And this understanding, the degree to which this is achieved, could lead to very differently designed ABMs. So I'll describe an approach to improve the clarity in the pathway from evidence to model design using rule-based outputs. It's an approach that tries to identify and prioritize important qualitative aspects that could be included in an ABM from a high volume of empirical data, which I think was mentioned earlier. It's an approach that tries to reveal patterns in different decision-making profiles, which is sometimes hidden, more hidden using other methods. And it tries to address these issues of rigor and replicability. But overall, to try and improve the design and the content of ABMs. So these knowledge elicitation tools basically represent a stepwise standardized process that starts from data collection and understanding the context to co-designing an interactive game with stakeholders and then applying it during semi-structured interviews. It also involves a verification and validation stage, and the heuristics and rules that are produced as an output are then iterated with stakeholders in a reflexive way. So this provides a rich structured process that enables the identification of factors that could be prioritized in the simulation. And this is because of the high number of responses in the game that is developed. So it's a game interview basically. And this is also because of the iterative process of verification and validation that's key. NETS uses an ethnographic fieldwork approach to co-explore with stakeholders what their worldview is, what terminology they use, what their decision criteria are, and the different perceptions of risk to create a very context-specific game reflecting their priorities, preferences, and strategies. And this uses new statistical measurements and a classification algorithm to verify the degree of accuracy of the resulting decision trees. So the idea is it could generate new insights into the evidence collected and provide rules for an ABM that could also allow new insights to be generated. So the approach can take a lot of other qualitative data, so baseline vulnerability assessments in our case, interviews, focus group discussions, and so on. And the NETS process basically tries to convert all of these things into a game, which here you can see the criteria that come through in the empirical data are translated into drivers, goals, and strategies. And the output of this is a set of rules which could look like this or can be mapped into a decision tree like this. And this represents rules from male and female farmers, incorporating the drivers and strategies that you saw previously in the game and from the empirical data. So I won't go into too much detail about the case study here because where this was applied in the Congo Basin forest, except to say that the aim of the project was to reduce social vulnerability and alleviate poverty, whilst at the same time looking at the co-benefits and trade-offs of agroforestry practices on forest livelihoods, forest conservation, and therefore ultimately on climate change mitigation in general. From a household perspective, poor and better off households were included as part of the study. and they were split into a training set and a testing set for validation, and validation was done in 2 separate villages. So the assumption here is that there are co-benefits of cocoa agroforestry systems for forest conservation, livelihood potential, and climate change mitigation. But interviews and the NETS process revealed that due to reduced yield and quality because of increasing dry spells, soil infertility, and lack of land, there are signs that cocoa and subsistence agriculture may be expanded into virgin forests and trees felled. And if more labor and tools became available, this seems even more likely. So this paradox could render some of the agricultural practices more maladaptive in the long term. So for more information about this, please reference the paper online. But applying the NETS model here, I just want to reflect on some things that came out that I think were useful for changing how we would have designed an ABM otherwise. So there were several observations that proved some of our initial assumptions wrong. And some of this wouldn't have been possible without a more standardized, robust process as I've just described. So for one thing, the socioeconomic differences in strategy were subtly different. So our assumption was that communities in this region were doing pretty much the same thing under most conditions because of a lack of alternatives. But the results from the game interviews indicated that different groups were purposefully responding to different drivers, but in very subtle ways. And these subtle differences in active behavior are obviously really important to represent in an ABM. There were also limited drivers of decision-making that could be narrowed down. So there was a lot of information from the baseline vulnerability assessment, the focus groups, and the discussions that we'd had previously. And this was limited to a set of 11 drivers, but the final game interview results actually suggested that even fewer drivers were salient to decision-making. But the value of this kind of in-depth qualitative work is knowing which rules are important to model from those. Finally, gender differentiated decision-making was really interesting. So most of the goals of women from both poor and better off households were similar as they perform similar subsistence activities and collect non-timber forest products from the forest for medicinal purposes. But the reality was that their driving forces were quite different. And in one case, the collection of non-timber forest products was significantly different between poor and better off women. And this is something that would be really valuable to model in an ABM to establish what macro level or longer term impacts of such a strategy might be. And this was quite difficult to uncover without looking at the decision trees and the outcomes of the NETS process. So the complementarity of the two is that NETS has been useful in identifying the most salient drivers, such as markets, labor, land availability, and access to agricultural tools, which were important drivers triggering a lot of livelihood strategies amongst poor households particularly. Climate drivers were not so important to poorer households, possibly because they were not growing cash crops as much like cocoa. However, some of the strategies could introduce negative cascading effects on sustainable forest use. Such as if in the case of more tools becoming available or more labor becoming available, which could lead to a faster expansion of the cocoa forest at the expense of the forest. And this might outweigh some of the mitigation and livelihood benefits, resulting in maladaptation actually. And an ABM could be useful here to test this over the long term. Looking at things like unmanaged expansion and the reduced time for crop rotation, which was also mentioned, could be included in an ABM. So the verification stage increases the transparency of this process because it allows participants to reflect on and refine the output of the game interview and provide feedback. It allows gaps to be addressed and new information to be added or errors to be corrected. And some of the decision trees can be reordered as well to make them more logical or to redistribute where the enabling criteria should be in a decision tree. And sometimes such additional and sometimes tacit information is gathered using this process of verification. So here we can see a very sort of complex looking decision tree for poor farmers, and going through the verification process, some of these light green elements were new things that were mentioned. And just to emphasize a bit more, the tacit knowledge that could be useful input for an ABM, for example, relates to temporal and spatial complexity as well as new social rules. So there was information provided about new plants and fruit trees that would be planted within cocoa fields due to their different short and long-term growth patterns, which wasn't obvious from the original baseline vulnerability assessment. The expansion of cocoa fields, as I've mentioned, was considered because of a lack of yield and quality of crop due to soil infertility and increasing dry spells and a lack of land, actually. Spatial complexity, there was some interesting new information around where crops would be planted if the dry season was prolonged, and also the reduced rotation periods of fallow areas to compensate for reduced land area and reduced yield. And I've mentioned the socioeconomic and gender differentiated differences. So I won't go into that for further. From a validation perspective, this also provides supplementary information, and this was done in another village, independently of the village where the training data was tested and where the game was designed. The statistical data provided the degree of error in the classification created from the original training data, and it also facilitated an analysis of decision-making across heterogeneous groups. And this obviously is useful when thinking about possible variations of agents that would be appropriate to include in an ABM. So, if the resulting decision trees were coded into a social simulation, there would be a clear link to the data collected in the next game interview, which itself can be traced back to various sources of empirical evidence, such as our vulnerability assessment, socio-environmental histories, surveys, and so on. And this provides a transparency to others who want to inspect the social simulation design. It also provides an understanding of how and why certain decision processes have been represented and why perhaps others won't be. And where the evidence for the different aspects of the model originates. So this addresses some of the challenges that were mentioned earlier, such as creating a structured, more rigorous and replicable approach, and generates new insights into evidence collected, and identifies priorities for social simulation development. And under differing scenarios of the future, there may be particular thresholds above which an adaptation strategy that may be beneficial in providing benefits in the long term, or in the short term rather, actually becomes maladaptive in the long term. So in summary, the chain of evidence from ABM to original qualitative data can be traced, as mentioned by Bruce earlier. This process has allowed us to see clear differences between groups and within groups in the villages we worked in, which was otherwise quite hidden, particularly the gender differentiated aspect. The process actually does simplify to quite a large extent the large volume of qualitative data to a few salient drivers that can be modeled, as mentioned earlier, as a challenge. Structuring this data into a game supports the understanding of the context through a co-exploration of various scenarios with stakeholders. So it's continually subject to refinement and improvement. And interestingly, with Better Off Farmers, it was the case that they employed a lot of diverse strategies, but their main objective was one goal, which was growing a cash crop. So although when we spoke to them, it looked like they were being very adaptive and doing lots of different things, the ultimate goal was very singular, whereas that was quite different for poorer farmers. So while this process has helped gain a better understanding of drivers and livelihood choices and the impacts of their interactions and functioning at a village level, and what could lead to successful adaptation or maladaptation, an ABM could model the impacts at scale and provide further recommendations. For instance, looking at how far into the future the co-benefits and mitigation potential of agroforestry would be retained in such a shaded polyculture system, despite other factors coming into play, such as market prices, fluctuating market prices, availability of labor, tools, and future climate change, and what impact this would have on community vulnerability in the long term. But I just want to emphasize that if we had tried to design the ABM without carrying out this process, the model would have looked very different and included very different and possibly more general rules. So that's not to say there are not challenges still with this process. And I think we're all aware of lots of these. But some of them obviously are that there's still lots of inconsistency in responses, no matter how well designed the game is. That is dealt with to some degree by the algorithm, and the verification and validation process. Time constraints are also a massive issue. So this consideration of how we improve the link between modelers and social scientists, I think one of the big things is the time constraints that are needed to accurately get an understanding of the social context. And the other interesting thing from a climate change perspective is how to include and elicit information about new vulnerability that has not yet been experienced is an interesting one for our work. I think I'll leave it there. So thank you. And I'd be interested to hear any questions.
Thank you very much, Sukaina. So let's see, Christophe has a question. Please, Christophe.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to maybe to ask you clarification regarding what you call a game interview, and also you are talking about the game itself. Could you explain a little bit more how they are related, if you are talking about the same thing, or?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, so the game interview is basically a series of if-then scenarios. So if I just go back to this not very nice image, but basically this is not presented to the stakeholder, but for the researcher, what's really helpful is to have so when understanding the decision context and the worldview of the informants and what's driving their vulnerability, we often get a set of criteria like the environmental constraints, the economic constraints, and the social constraints that are affecting a decision. And in this case, the decision or the goal is basically a range of crops, as shown here. And in the process of getting to know the domain, we also become familiar with a lot of the strategies of either coping or adaptation strategies, which are on the right-hand side here, which are employed when a particular goal is chosen. So this game is basically for the researcher to design a set of interview questions to say, if increasing dry spells in the small wet season and more wind, and there's more access to urban markets, and you have access to training on agroforestry techniques, what would you do? And then the informant would choose a crop or a set of crops here from the goals, and they may choose a set of strategies that would be required to successfully grow that crop because of the constraints that are on the left. So if they're increasing dry spells, they may still grow cocoa, but they may supplement that with maize and plantain as well. And so what happens is this it's kind of in the background, and it's used to pose some interview questions, and those responses are recorded in the game. And then you get this set of scenarios whereby the algorithm then tries to pattern match common responses to a common set of criteria. And that's how the rules are generated. So when a common set of rules is frequently associated with a particular goal, it becomes a rule. And the confidence in that rule is obviously dependent on the frequency that that's chosen.
Okay. And you do it with a group of stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I've done it with individually with farmers. So individual interviews with many farmers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Timo, you had a question. I seen your hand.
Yeah, so Christophe basically asked everything. So I also thought that this presentation was super interesting. Thank you very much. Maybe one follow-up question also about the game. So you played it individually. I was interested, how did you choose the stakeholders that you play with?
Yeah, that's a good question and really important to the design, to the confidence of the rule. So we spent some time trying to identify better off and poor households in the village. So we wanted to get the biggest difference possible in strategies. And we then interviewed them cumulatively for this. So we assumed that they're the same profile, and we interviewed them consecutively from the same set, if that makes sense. And we did it in a village. So we split the set, we split into a training set and a test set as well. So there was a training set of individuals that were used, that were involved in co-designing the game, you know, indirectly, and then playing the game indirectly and doing the interviews. And then those rules were taken back and verified with the same group, and then also with the training group, the testing group, sorry. And then they were validated again in the village with another group that was of the same profile, similar profile, and in another village of the same profile.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Is there a possibility to like read up on this process, like especially
yeah, sure.
gaming?
I can share the link to this paper in the chat, and I can. I'm happy to follow up as well by email.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that Bruce already shared some links to Sukaina's PhD thesis and to the paper I think that you presented, but please double check, Sukaina.
Okay, thank you.
And share whatever other resources you might have on this topic.
Thank you.
Yes. Now Martin had a question.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. Just a brief question are the results of your simulation somehow transferred back to the stakeholders? And if yes, how did you do that?
Yeah, so in this particular project, we unfortunately didn't get to the point of implementing the simulation. We designed it, and we, for various reasons, couldn't go back to the case study. But we have done that in other cases where we have run the model or developed a model, and then I think that is another important element. So we haven't done that, but it would be really interesting to go back and test those results. I do have colleagues, I think Richard Taylor, who Bruce mentioned earlier, has done that in some other projects. So that process of verification and validation is really key, I think, both at this stage of collecting the data, but also in the production of the model.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so are there any other questions or comments? I think not. I don't see any hand here. But then thank you very much again, Sukaina.
Thank you.
Now we can say that the second part of our session is closed, and we take a short break where I will pause the recording. So we all get back at 20 past 12. And we'll continue with the third part of our session. So until then, we just take a short break. Thank you. So welcome everybody to the third part of our workshop on integrating qualitative and quantitative evidence using social simulation. We have now a presentation by Patricia Antolf from University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She's going to talk about juggling quant, qual, and simulation lessons learned in the Smarties project. So Patricia, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm trying to share my screen. However, I'm not sure if it will share.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Can you see?
Yes.
Can you see my presentation?
No, we can see the program of the Social Simulation Week.
Yeah, so that's a bit problematic. Okay, how do I do that again? If I do share screen, okay.
Now we can see your slides.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll start. Thank you very much for being here. I think it's really lovely to see a lot of faces that I already know, and there's quite a lot of people, so it's also awesome to see some new people that I don't know yet. So welcome to this third part of the session and to my presentation. I'm going to talk about juggling quantitative, qualitative, and simulation techniques in the project of Smarties that I work in. And just to tell you, just like 3 words about Smarties, just the context that you need to know to understand the rest of the presentation. Smarties is looking at successful examples of social innovations. And we're creating agent-based models of those successful examples of social innovations. And we're working with 10 successful cases around Europe. So all in all, there's going to be 10 agent-based models, and each agent-based model is going to be of a city. And I will mainly focus my discussion on the Groningen model, because I'm from the University of Groningen now, and this is this is the model in which I work the most. So this is going to continue by focusing a little bit on the Groningen model. So in the entire project, and I think this is kind of the main lesson learned, and something that I would advise everyone to do. We've set up, it's a Horizon 2020 project, and it was set up in a way that we have a lot of freedom in what data collection techniques we use, if any. So we didn't have a research design that would be ABC, and whatever happens, we're going to do ABC. We had a setup that would allow us to kind of juggle the techniques depending on how much we wanted certain type of data. So all of the cases started with desk research, and I think this was the most important thing, to kind of know what we already have. So when we elicit new data, we only double the data that we think should be doubled. So we only use triangulation of data sources when we think that this should be used. But all in all, we kind of we identify the gaps in data that we have, and then we design or choose a technique to elicit data to fill the information gap that we have. Then we usually did either in-depth interviews or focus group interviews. Then we did surveys. Then we used theories, and we built agent-based models. Then there's workshops with stakeholders and final simulations. So this is the overall research design. And I think theory is one of the main things main sources of model assumptions that drives our models. So we've designed a social cognitive architecture, which is HUMAT. So meet Adamat and Eve, Adamat 1.0 and Eve 42. So what they do, they are embedded in social networks, and they do cognitively motivated information exchange in social networks. So I'm going to name some of the theories that went into that architecture. So basically, we talk about behaviors, and from the theories that we have, we identified several things that motivate us, our behaviors, and this is kind of how satisfying a behavior is. What are the groups and social norms, and what is the information that you get from others that would recommend the behavior or discourage you from doing that behavior. So some of the theories we based our assumptions of the architecture on is needs theories, cognitive dissonance or cognitive inconsistency theories, memory formation theories. In terms of persuasiveness of other humans in social networks, we've used alter ego comparison studies, source credibility theories. So this is kind of the basic architecture. A lot of theory went in. I would say it doesn't have inconsistencies. So one theory does not exclude assumptions of another theory. It works quite well. So that's one part of the agent-based model. The other part is desk research. And we use something that we call behavioral archaeology. So all of our cases are already successful cases, which means that they happened in the past. Groningen case happened in 1994, which is 25 years ago. So kind of when reviewing what data is available, we looked at several sources, different sources of data, and obviously for each case, some sources might be there, some sources might not be there. And the data is fairly incomplete. So we've used statistical yearbooks, various sorts of newspaper articles, any scientific publications if available, official reports from events, maps, and so on and so on. So that's our desk research. And just to give you some example in the Groningen model, if you look at Adamat, so Adamat, as an agent, he has social, demographical, and geographical characteristics. So he's a male, he's got age, he's got education, he's got main economic activity, he lives somewhere in Groningen, and then he's got motives for behaving. So he's got how important a need for children is when you think about the vote. That was the social innovation. How important the need to travel through the park is when voting about the park. How important is the social need, so conforming to his group of peers. How important are the environmental values for him, and so on and so on. And then Adamat has social networks. So he's got family members, he's got neighbors, he's got friends, he's got fellow students, as he is a student. So this is where the information exchange happens in his social networks. So when we used, for example, statistical yearbooks to calibrate the model, we used social demographical statistics about age, gender, main economic activity, and city district, which created 936 homogeneous groups of agents that comprise different fraction of the 1994 Groningen population. So, the social demographical profile of a person determines the social demographical profile of a district, and obviously some districts are poorer, some districts have more students, some districts have more retired people, and so on and so on. So this is how we use statistical yearbooks to model, to calibrate our model to 1994 Groningen. We also used household composition data from statistical yearbooks to inform the size of family networks and where they live. And we also used desk research, so statistical yearbook information, to kind of tell us how large the neighborhood networks would be in all of the districts, because obviously that differs district by district. Some districts, people feel safer and know their neighbors. Some districts in the city are not, do not have that same perception, and you're not friends with your neighbors, so you don't talk to them. Then we used scientific publication. In Groningen, we actually were very lucky. We had like 10 papers on the process that we could use, and those scientific papers helped us to identify the institutions and the organizations, their interest, why would they lobby for a certain solution, why would they not lobby for a certain solution. It helped us to establish case timeline and identify motives, so those importance of needs for typical nodes behavior, so for regular residents behavior, not organizations. Then we had primary data collection. So we had per case 6 to 10 individual in-depth interviews or focus group interviews, depending on who we wanted to interview and what data we needed. Then we had a survey, 500 to 1,000 people per case. And now we're at the stage of very soon holding stakeholder policy workshops. And this is, we're going to have 2 workshops per case. So we use the primary data from in-depth interviews to calibrate the model as well. So to confirm identified critical nodes, so identify prominent organizations and institutions that would support the social innovation or oppose the social innovation. How we used it to explore relationships between those critical nodes. So for example, between the opposition and the media. We identified again and confirmed motives for certain actions that certain groups of people would be motivated by, and information about communication strategies in core discussion networks of people. So who was talking to whom, about what, and why. Then we used our survey to estimate clusters of egos with similar motives for actions. So we have this, it is supported by data that we already have, that your social demographic characteristics and your geographical location determines to a fair extent what is important to you. So if you live close to the park, that is so closing the park for cars is the social innovation. If you live close to the park, you are a lot more, you have a larger probability of voting. So kind of using those social, demographical, geographical characteristics, we would like to do cluster analysis on them and see which groups have similar motives for actions and which actions. We also use that to estimate interest of various groups of alters. So, so how would your friends vote in your immediate family members, your friends, or your colleagues? How would they support or oppose that social innovation? And we used it to estimate the persuasiveness of various groups of alters. So how important is the information from your family on your own decision, from your friends on your own decision, from your work colleagues on your own decision? And then we're using these techniques also to validate the model. So this is the actual piece of a report from 1994 on the vote, which was the kind of about closing the park, which was the social innovation. So we used available reports to kind of tell us, okay, which district voted, so what was the turnout, and which district voted how, so that we could recreate, simulate the voting in our agent-based model, and use the data from the report to validate our predictions of the model. So this is all from me for the presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you. So let's see if there are any questions or comments. Yes, Pierre.
Sorry. I was wondering, can not too much data be too much? Because you have an unlimited amount of data, which everyone might dream of. But I have the feeling that maybe you are over-calibrating things because you have multiple sources of information for the same thing that you're trying to model. So how do you deal with this kind of danger?
So yeah, I think this is a very fair question, and it's kind of and it speaks also to what Sakina was talking about. So so for me, triangulation of data sources. So I would use a similar. Let's say I would identify motives. I would identify motives from the literature, from newspapers, from in-depth interviews, and then from a survey. Why so many data sources? And I think it's so the secondary data, like the newspaper articles and the publication, would give us examples of what motives were important, but we don't know who those motives were important for. So when we do a survey and put those motives in a survey and ask people how important is that motive for you, we can estimate which groups those motives were important for, and whether those groups, whether there are some social demographical characteristics that make homogeneous groups. So I think even though we ask the same question, we get kind of, it's really a different question. It's about, not only what were the motives, but which groups were motivated by which motives. This is also a danger. And I think it was a danger for us to find out that that a lot of people now, so basically we're doing a survey 25 years after the case was implemented. So doing a survey now, if you ask people, oh, how important is the environment for you? All of the people say, yes, the environment is super important. The park is for the bats and for the birds, and it's amazing, and so on and so on. And right now in a survey, we see that as a very prominent motive. However, we know from the in-depth interviews and from the publications that in 1994, that was not the case. And we actually have a similar thing, not only with the Groningen case, we have a similar case with fuel poverty. So when you ask people, like when cities are motivated now to, for example, implement a heating network, a lot of residents would support it because it's ecological, or a lot of like environment as a motive now. However, when you look at successful cases, when that happened, environment was not a motive whatsoever. Those were just poor cities. And the main motive was financial. No one was thinking about the environment. It was just cheaper. So it's a nice thing, but there's also dangers, as you said.
Could you not have used role play for this then, to tell people to imagine they go back in time and how they would respond?
I could, but you know, with the memory effects, it's so when we talked about, I think it was important for us when we did individual in-depth interviews with like prominent stakeholders. So they would tell us, no, people didn't really think about that when we wanted. So for example, shopkeepers really wanted the park to stay open for cars, because they thought that as soon as the road is closed, people cannot use the car to go to their shops. So we were talking to some prominent shopkeepers that were active in that case in 1994, and then they basically said, you know, these are the arguments that spoke to people. This is how we build support for our opposition. So yeah, that helped us a lot. But obviously, kind of memory and imagining things has its limits. So people don't tend to remember things that happened a long time ago super well.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
Yes, Bruce, but first Bruce and then Sebastian.
Yes, so when I've done stuff like this, what people find very difficult is thinking about something outside of the context you're giving them. So they will tell you about the context they have in mind and what they might do or their opinions, but they won't tell you about their different opinions if they were thinking from different points of view, for example, as a father or something like that. And it's quite difficult to get a sort of more holistic picture. Did you have any experience or any techniques for dealing with that?
Yeah, so for us, obviously, kind of, we know that this is the case. So we know, for example, that that there was so for people who had small kids who would play in the park, they really wanted the park closed for cars because safety of their kids was an issue. And now, like in in-depth interviews, that might have come up once. So we thought that it could be a fair motive, but I think only by analyzing for whom that motive is important in a survey, whether it is only parents with small kids, or how far away from the park do you have to live for that motive to be important for you. This is how we can check that. However, we have a huge problem with the survey because, you know, we have, for Groningen, we have 725 people answered the survey, and it was an online survey, so sampling wasn't really there. And we have some groups that are underrepresented and some groups that are not represented at all. So for example, we have literally no one with primary level of education. And from previous analysis, we know that education was a main factor. And we kind of, by the data that we have, we're limited to checking. Like, we're gonna have to make some assumptions about that, but we cannot really check that.
Thank you, Patricia. We have now Sebastian with a question, and then Martin had a question.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks for the presentation. Good to see you again after almost a year. So I have a similar question like Peer. It's not only that you used a comprehensive set of data, but also a comprehensive set of theory, right? So could you maybe say a little bit more about how you brought those theories together? Did you have to check like how they fit together? Because it seems like it's not like intuitive that you can just use a bunch of theories and throw them together. So what was the methodology behind that?
So I think the biggest challenge was that we're using social theories, but social theories from very different domains. So for example, for cognitive dissonance, this is a very kind of cognitive psychology, strongly cognitive psychology, cognitively psychological theory. And it has actually a lot of versions. So from when it was created 50 years ago, everyone, I think every psychologist would agree that there are cognitive dissonances that motivate our behavior. However, they do not agree how it happens, what kind of factors actually play a role there, and so on and so on. So just to go through those branches of cognitive inconsistency theories and check which do they actually have contradictory assumptions. And it turns out that for the main assumptions, they're not really contradictory. You know, some people say that it is more a cognitive process. Some people say that it impacts behavior a lot more. So that was not a problem. So kind of establishing like the cognitive part of the architecture, and then establishing the social part of the architecture. So how do you share information in networks? Who do you listen to? When you have a problem and you don't know what to do, you're like A or B, it's got pros and cons, all of it has pros and cons. Who do you ask? There are a lot, like those sociological theories usually, but sometimes like psychology of marketing theories are a lot more fragmented. And there was a very good review from 2014 that we used to kind of systematize that knowledge, because it's just not a consistent theory. It's just 1 million studies. And I think reviews helped us a lot to clarify how that would work and what are the main factors. And then, but we think that for our cases, some factors are more important in some cases than others. So for example, trust isn't really a thing in Groningen, but trust is a huge thing for the Aberdeen model and for the Timisoara model. So how much do you trust your local government? And yes, so all in all, we try to have the same kind of assumptions for 10 models, but they are going to differ because each case has its own context. So yeah, does that answer you in any way?
Yeah, I would say it mostly does. But may I ask a follow-up question, Melania? Can I do that? Yeah. Because what you could also do in terms of robustness analysis, that you would strip the model one by one of its parts to see if you can still generate the same results, right? So if I understood you correct, you kept all the parts in, but then you check for the influence each of these parts has, and then you see, okay, trust have no influence in this certain situation here, or in this certain case to investigate. Does that make a difference? Is that kind of the same? Maybe also, yeah.
So I think because of the way we've programmed the models and how the design idea for the models dictated what data we needed. So the model programming and getting the data were kind of intertwined. It's like, okay, so we need this rule, we need that rule. How do we need more interviews to get that information? So kind of stripping the model from assumptions now would be very difficult, because those assumptions, kind of a certain part of the model was already there when we got a different set of assumptions and we integrated some assumptions to other assumptions. So I guess, like, in terms of reprogramming the model to strip it from the assumptions, in some cases it would be very difficult now. So I can check whether, for example, if gender makes any difference, and I can, get rid of gender and see whether it's fine, but I wouldn't be able to establish households because I am combining a man and a woman together and either giving them a child or not. So if I get rid of gender, how do I generate households?
All right, thank you.
Okay, Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, for this interesting participation. Nice to see you again. And I would like to start my question with a comment, because in your first slides, when you showed the overall research process, you also referred to desk research, fieldwork, and social theory, and so on. And when you explained the social theory, you came basically to psychological theories. And I think this is kind of observation which is quite typical for many ABM research, that we focus much on psychological theories. But I come to this question when you started talking about critical notes or important notes. And certainly here, I would say the good theories from political science of power differentials could also be a case, could be relevant for the case. So could you say something about what kind of nodes, what kind of actors were powerful, what were their means of power, how could they, why were they powerful for this particular case and perhaps not for another case? And what was the interest constellation? And who actually put the social innovation closing down the park to the agenda at all at the first instance? So this just, I'm curious about that, if you could say something on it.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna kind of try to keep it brief, but it's an awesome question. It's a very large question, and we're still facing it. So basically, we've got critical nodes. Different types of institutions and community groups were important in different cases. So for Groningen, for example, you had the Bikers Association, who were the supporters of closing the park for cars. You had the disability people, or the advocacy groups that were in favor. You actually had a bus community, like the Dutch bus organization, that played a role and was like actively participating in meetings. So those were all supporters. City planners were also supporters. Then in opposition, you had mainly shopkeepers, but those shopkeepers had a huge influence. There's a business club in Groningen, and those shopkeepers actually organized themselves. Like, I think each year they had like a different institution that would be an advisory institution. And you need to know that the deliberation process took 15 years. So the idea to close the park for cars was introduced by a political party. So actually the city council was against, but the politicians were for. So city council actually had different plans. And then there were literally 15 years of negotiations with citizens and organizations. And it's interesting, like in terms of strategies of what they used to kind of to get support. Then in different cases that we have, those were different strategies. So for example, Stockholm sent people letters. We're gonna modernize your house, prepare to stop living in it in 3 months. And people were outraged and, you know, went to the city council and started throwing tomatoes, which is like the ultimate outrage in the Scandinavian countries. In Samso, there were also a part of letters, but there were meetings. In Groningen, meetings and meetings and meetings, and consultancy groups and meetings. So kind of different strategies were there from promoters of the social innovation on how to build consensus, whether they even wanted to build consensus, and how to reach it. And those strategies, we actually are at the moment of eliciting a list of those strategies in stakeholder workshops. So then we can recreate the history of an event with the strategies that happened, and then run counterfactual scenarios to see what would be effects of different strategies. So we can ask a question of, okay, you organized 25 meetings, but what would you do if rather than organizing meetings, you would convince the opposition to be a supporter? Or what would happen with a vote if instead of organizing meetings, you would in the municipality employ someone from the communities that were most problematic, because that was also one of the strategies in Stockholm. Or what would happen if instead of organizing meetings, you would send out letters to people? So we can, like, once we recreate the actual history and validate it, we can play with those counterfactual scenarios, which would be the strategies for, yeah, getting more support for your option.
Thanks for the comprehensive answer. Overview.
Okay, so are there any other questions or comments for Patricia? No?
Nothing that could be answered in a few minutes.
Yes, because I say we have only 8 minutes left until 1 o'clock when we are supposed to close our session, which means that actually we cannot really go through all our program. We had a fishbowl programmed, but we need more time for a fishbowl. So we are going to skip it and most probably organize it with a different, in a different event.
Just to say to everyone, we were thinking of having a long discussion session at another time in the coming weeks, or maybe to get so everyone has time to discuss these issues. So if they're interested in joining that, what do they do, Melania?
If they're interested in joining
the discussion session that we'll arrange in the future, in the near future, what should they do? Email you, or just wait for the announcements?
Wait for the announcement.
Okay.
Because I mean, we announce our events on the email list of the special interest group and also on the SIMSOC list. So if anybody here is on neither of these, then please send me an email. And then I will add you, and if you want to join our SIG, I will add you to the email list of the SIG. If not, I'll keep you on a separate list and inform you when we have our events. In the questionnaire that you were asked to fill in when registering for this event, I asked if you are interested in joining the SIG, and all those persons who said yes, I will contact them after, most probably next week or by the end of September, because next week I have teaching the whole week. So I will contact all those who said that they want to join the SIG and ask them to confirm in an email, and then add their email addresses to the email list of the SIG. So that was a long answer to your question, Bruce. People will be announced when we organize our event. But this event for sure will not be in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It will be maybe further in the semester. So actually, there was a question that we had for you now at the end of this session. What kind of events would you be interested in the SIG to organize? Of course, taking into consideration the COVID situation and the fact that we cannot really travel, but we can do stuff online. So what would you be interested in attending, or what would you be interested in? More hands-on session, more presentations, more discussions? What would you like us to organize? Any comments? Yes, Sandy.
I just think thanks for organizing this event. It's excellent. I just think it might be just as Bruce said. I think we just need more time to have free discussions. I feel like because you are really good at moderating the sessions to keep the time, but at the same time, I think some vivid discussions has to be cut short, and so we have a chance like have more discussions. And also for such events, it would be also nice to have some like a coffee break, a virtual coffee break. We have some free chat, and that would be better. I mean, there are some tools to facilitate this virtual coffee break. I think that's the thing we miss the most when we don't have the coffee break. You know, for the virtual conference, you just listen to the lecture, but more useful is to have some chat to informal kind of discussions. That would be very useful.
Okay, thank you. I wrote down your proposals. Good. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? No. Yes, Martin.
Maybe it's not the right place here to discuss it now, but for me, I was curious that in the both more, so to say, keynote lectures by Juliet and Bruce, it referred quite to relatively old papers. So the question is, what did we achieve in the last 10 to 15 years? This is a question I would like to discuss in a later session.
Bruce, do you have a comment?
It took a while to get Melania on board and organize things.
Okay, and then we have on the chat some proposals, karaoke that somebody has to organize. Harpo should organize karaoke, and then quiz. So we are going to take all these comments seriously for our next event. Sebastian, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so I took parts in like 1 or 2 other workshops before, and what I usually liked, they were also conducted in Zoom, that you can use this breakout sessions. So maybe if you can organize a program where we have several like little discussion groups come together for half an hour, work on something, present it in the big group again. I think that would be nice and imitate a little bit the closer social contacts that we are all missing right now.
Yes, I put it on the list. Okay, any other final remarks? We have still 1 minute.
Thank you all for organizing and for the nice talks. It's really a really nice session.
Yeah, thank you,
Nanda.
Melania, for keeping it all so close.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's very nice that so many people were actually participating here and having questions and following. That's really nice. So we are a growing community, and in 10 years from now, we'll have a lot of things to report to the people who join in 10 years from now. Okay. Bruce, do you want to say anything now as closing? No? Okay. Then thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice afternoon and a nice social simulation week. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.